Most of my ideas about French history when I was growing up in Lahore, where we were barely taught any history at school, were from the novels of Alexander Dumas. It really gave me an interest in French history which never left me, and many other similar novels. And so when I started writing these novels, it was a process which took me over, which I'd never actually engaged in before. And it was for me personally, it was very educative and also surprising. You know, because when you're writing a novel, often something comes out from inside you which you didn't even know was there. And in a number of these novels, characters emerged which I felt were taking over the book, and characters I hadn't even planned to be in the book, and characters of different sorts. So it was a very rewarding experience. And for those of you interested in history, you will always find in novels of historical fiction something which you will never get in the history books. And often I'm asked in the Arab world, well, you could have done this as a book. And I said I couldn't have done the book, Saladin's fictional memoirs, as a book, because this sort of great Kurdish leader who united the Arabs, a very difficult task at the best of times, actually had 16 children, 4 wives, 20 concubines. No one knows the history of the women, but no one. So it has to be imagined. How can one, write about it otherwise? And that you can't do in a straightforward work of history. So there are many challenges which come up like that, and they are interesting challenges, and have been very pleasurable for me. Thank you.
So I'm going to go ahead and open up. We have a few people with microphones here. Please just raise your hand and let us know if you have a question to ask. I see someone right there.
Thank you very much for your luminous lecture. My question is, I have worked on the interdisciplinary approach, like the relationship between fiction and ethnography.
The relationship between?
Fiction and ethnography. So while I was working on this, I found that the people, those who are using the techniques of fiction in writing ethnography, are facing some challenges. My question is that when you are writing fiction, you can say, breaking down the prisms between the disciplines like history and fiction or literature, what sort of challenges you do face personally?
The first point to make is that when I'm writing historical fiction, and I think most writers of historical fiction, but certainly in my case that's true, I never take liberties with history itself. So I don't make up fake historical events, nor do I change the history of what happened. Some people do that, but in a very conscious way. By saying, suppose Britain had been invaded by the Germans and occupied, what would have happened? But that's another project which people do. But in the historical novels I write, I keep the history there, and around historical episodes you construct the rest of the novel. Because I think it's very dangerous if you start, and it can be very confusing as well. So that was a big challenge initially when I started writing, to see what one could play with and what one couldn't. But there was enough to play with without actually challenging history. Apart from that, I don't think I had too many other dilemmas, really. I mean, I was saying that sexuality in the Muslim world today is such a sort of charged subject, but this wasn't always the case. I mean, if you look at Arab literature from the 9th and 10th century, and if you look at the Arabian Nights, the short stories in the Arabian Nights, what are they about? They're essentially quite a lot of them are about sexual practices and sexual adventures. So even that inhibition is something created by the modern world, which didn't exist in that sense in the medieval world, and certainly not in Islam. I mean, people say, which is accurate, that homosexuality is forbidden in Islam. It is, as it is in the Old Testament as well, very sternly forbidden. But it doesn't mean that because something is forbidden, it doesn't happen. And in the Arabian Nights, one of the central characters is this impish poet, Abu Nuwas, who is based on a very real poet in the Khalifa's court, who was openly gay, proclaimed it, sang his gayness from the streets, talked about his lovers, and all that. So what do we do? The Khalifa of the time tolerated him, so why shouldn't we in this world tolerate him as well?
Mr. Ali, I know I'll get a chance to talk to you after, but there's a question I wanted to ask partly on behalf of our students to tease out one of the key points of your talk and your writing of recent years, which is that for the longest time, as you said, that right now we've been told that there's only the liberal democratic model or a neoliberal version of it left and nothing else. One of the claims of this model has been that it has had a far better self-correcting mechanism than the communist or other models, which were very intolerant, as you yourself said, and therefore they failed. But we're seeing this phenomenon in this post-Berlin Wall phase where people's protest goes unheeded. You have a billion men marching, billions of men and women marching across countries on the same day. It doesn't stop a war. You have Occupy Wall Street. So there is this, and even the Arab Spring, shifting contexts. So for the first time in a long time, it seems power and capital has an absolute obdurate non-responsiveness to civic cries. And the last time that happened, say in the 1930s, the ultimate result was first a depression, then a great war. So are we going to see any self-correction? Or is there a way to come out of it, or are we going to go through a repeat of the great calamitous forms of correction?
Very important question, actually. I don't think we're going to see wars between the big powers. I really don't think that. A number of reasons. The reason for the Second World War and the First World War was rivalries between the big imperial powers for colonies. I mean, we remember German fascism only now because of the Holocaust and the killing of 6 million Jews, but they did, there was, apart from that, horrific though that was, there was, from their point of view, a basis for the war, which had nothing to do with what they did to the Jews, which they said it's not fair that France and Britain, which are smaller countries than us, but one controls so much % of the world and the other controls so much %, and the Germans control a tiny amount. So either they do a deal with us and share the colonies, or we are going to go to war. It's spelt out in several speeches by the fascist leaders. So it was an imperialist and inter-imperialist war, like the first one, which was also a war over colonies and wealth in the rest of the world. And that period is now over, because that was a time when the powers that be were roughly equal. The United States in the First World War barely had an army. They had to really recruit and, enforce conscription to bring soldiers to Europe. And then when they went back, most of those people went back to their jobs, and the army had to be created again for the same. Nowadays, you have permanent armies, and you have the development of technology to such a high level, and the United States, as the dominant power in the world today, has military strength which exceeds that of all its rivals put together. So no one is going to challenge that. And the European countries are not going to fight each other. So where wars take place, It's in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, places like that. I don't think the big powers are going to go to war. And I don't think the Chinese are planning to arm themselves like the Russians did to try and achieve equality. Because any Chinese economist you speak with say that we know that's what brought the Soviet Union down, this crazy attempt to compete with the United States in terms of missiles and all this sort of stuff, which they couldn't afford to do. We are not going to do that. We are effectively building a defense mechanism around China. If we are attacked, we will defend ourselves. We are not going to wage wars and the like. Now, that may change, but even if that changes, the last thing the Chinese want is a war with the United States. Leaving aside all other aspects of it, the two economies are still pretty much interdependent. So I don't think that is going to happen. Wars will happen, probably carry on happening between smaller countries, though even here the possibilities are increasingly getting more difficult for this. I mean, if you look at South Asia, where India and Pakistan have fought 3 or 4 wars, both now have nuclear weapons. And that's the ultimate logic, that if India is now so overwhelmingly powerful in terms of manpower, technology, and weaponry, that it would be a very crazy general in Pakistan or politician who decided to go and make a war on India, and vice versa. It's not that battles or arguments and disputes between the major powers don't take place, but effectively they're largely about trade, building ports, who is going to do what, who's going to buy arms from whom. I mean, Bangladesh at the moment, relatively speaking, a small country in this large region, gets most of its bulk of its trade deals are with China. More than with India, though the black trade and the smuggling trade, if you add that, it's probably more than China, but official trade with China is much more. And then what happens when the Chinese ask the government for a deep water port? The government thinks, consults the Indians and the Americans, and they say no. So they say no to the Chinese. So I've noticed something here which is really very unusual, very, very unusual, because the Chinese don't do it so far anywhere else, is that the Chinese ambassador has been making statements in public about the political crisis in Bangladesh, which is incredible. And I think the reason for that is irritation that the Deepwater Port deal was scuttled, and an arms deal, where instead of buying weaponry from from China, they've decided to buy it from Russia, especially, I'm told, submarines and such like. And the Chinese must be saying, well, best of luck to Bangladesh, because the last country to buy submarines from Russia was India, and there was a huge accident not so long ago, and several hundred Indian soldiers naval personnel went down in the submarine, because it's well known to everyone that Russian work is now incredibly shoddy. It always was, and it hasn't improved. So these divisions will remain, but outright wars, I think not.
We have a question here.
Thank you. I thank God that you and I have lived to this day to meet each other for the second time. The first time was in 1970 when I was a student at Dhaka University, and you gave a lecture on under the mango tree. I was present there.
It was under the banyan.
No, mango.
No, banyan.
Amdala. I still remember it as Amdala. Anyway, you started your speech saying that पहले ये फैसला कर लो कि मैं उर्दू में कहूँ या इंग्लिश में कहूँ. Wasn't that the first sentence you said? Okay. Now you have given us a picture of the world, especially the general mass, and their very pitiable condition. it seems as if human civilization, from your lecture I gather, is going down in it very rapidly. I would request you to say a few words